Who raised you more? Your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? My family handed my brother a house wrapped in a bow, then turned right around and came to me asking to put my name on his debts. I wish I were exaggerating, but that is literally how it happened. One weekend, I was sitting in their living room while everyone toasted Evan's fresh start, and less than 48 hours later, I was being pitched like a bank teller asked to stamp a loan application. And it was not some vague request, it was specific and urgent, with numbers that would have followed me around for years. The celebration itself was exactly what you would expect in my family. Plenty of photos, plenty of speeches, and plenty of talk about how Evan just needed the right environment to finally get his life on track. They had balloons, a banner, and even a welcome home cake, like he had come back from overseas or something. The whole atmosphere was about redemption and second chances. And I sat there smiling politely, because what else do you do when your dad and stepmom stand up and talk about how proud they are to give their son a brand new start in a house with his name on the deed? Meanwhile, I am remembering the conversations years ago about how money was tight, how college savings were stretched thin, and how everyone had to make sacrifices. I did not say anything out loud, but the thought was sitting heavy in my chest while they passed around champagne. 2 mornings later, Dad and Renee came by with coffee, and I thought maybe they wanted to talk about moving furniture or painting or something practical. Instead, they sat down like they were about to deliver serious news, and then launched into how Evan's finances were a little complicated and not a big deal if we handle it smartly. I listened, because I wanted to hear the pitch in full before I reacted. They laid it out. Evan had stacked up several credit cards, a truck loan, some buy now pay later balances from home stores, and the total was high enough that his credit score was sinking. But if he could get a consolidation loan, everything would roll into one monthly payment at a lower interest rate. The only issue? He could not qualify a loan. They needed me to cosign. At first, I almost laughed. It was so bold I thought maybe I had misheard. My brother just received a literal house as a gift, and now they wanted me to tie my credit to his debts? I asked them point blank, so my signature is the part that makes the math work? And they said yes, with these reassuring smiles, like I should feel honored to be trusted. They tried to make it sound like family teamwork, like I would be helping him take responsibility, but anyone who has ever dealt with loans knows the ugly truth. Co-signing means you are equally responsible when payments are missed. It is not a symbolic gesture. It is a financial leash. I told them if they wanted me to even consider it, I would need to see every account, every balance, and every late payment notice. No summaries, no storytelling, actual paperwork. They hesitated, because handing over the documents meant admitting how messy things really were, but they eventually agreed. They wanted me to stay engaged, so they gave me a file folder that evening. And that was their first mistake, because once you put things in writing, you cannot argue it away later. That night I sat at my kitchen table going through the stack. It was exactly as ugly as I expected. Maxed out cards, fees piling up, late payments, and a truck loan that had already been deferred twice. But then I noticed something buried in the paperwork that stopped me cold. One of the loan documents had a memo line with a phrase I had not seen in years, the old nickname of my custodial college account. My account. The one that Dad used to tell me was my nest egg for school. It was a note on a transfer that clearly tied to the house down payment. I stared at that line for a long time. Suddenly, the champagne toasts and the welcome home cake looked a lot different in my memory. It was not just them being generous parents. There was a piece of my past in those walls, a chunk of money that had once been earmarked for me, quietly redirected into a foundation under Evan's name. And now they were sitting across from me asking for my signature, as if my role in all this was to keep giving so he could keep starting over. I closed the folder and sat back, and for the first time I was not just annoyed or resentful, I was alert. Something was not adding up, and if they thought I was going to put my credit on the line without getting answers, they had another thing coming. That was the moment I decided the conversation was about to change. I was not going to argue feelings anymore. I was going to deal in facts, and I already had the first one staring back at me in black and white. And if that memo said what I thought it said, then this was not about helping my brother out of a jam. This was about me being written out of the story while my money built the stage for his big comeback. And I can tell you right now, that was not going to stand. I did not sleep much after going through that file. I kept replaying the exact moment I saw the account nickname printed on that memo line, like a ghost from my own past had resurfaced to tap me on the shoulder. The name wasn't something random, it was specific, a shorthand ad, and I used back when I was still in high school, back when he'd pull up my custodial account on his laptop and show me the balance grow a few $100s at a time. Back when I still believed that the sacrifices I made, like taking AP classes instead of part-time work, skipping out-of-state colleges, and doing everything right, would be rewarded later. That memo wasn't just financial paperwork. It was a breadcrumb. A piece of evidence I hadn't even been looking for, but now that I'd found it, I couldn't stop following where it led. The next day, I took my lunch break alone and went to a quiet corner of the parking lot to call a loan officer I knew from work. I told her the situation in plain terms, no drama, just facts. I asked what co-signing would mean for me. She didn't sugarcoat it. If I co-signed and Evan missed even one payment, it would hit my credit just as hard as his. If he defaulted entirely, the creditors would come for me. And even if he paid on time, the debt would still sit on my report, raising my debt-to-income ratio and possibly messing with any future loan I tried to get, including the one I had quietly been researching for my own home. In other words, I wouldn't just be helping him out, I'd be tying myself to his mistakes for the next 5 to 7 years, minimum. And all of that for what? A man who had already shown he didn't treat deadlines seriously and who saw managing money as something future him would deal with. After work, I met up with Evan at a diner, partly because I wanted to keep it public. He tends to stay calmer when there's a table between us and people nearby, but mostly because I wanted to look him in the eye and give him a chance to explain himself. He showed up late, naturally, and didn't even bring a copy of the loan documents. He just shrugged and said he figured we'd talk it out. I ordered coffee and let him talk. He framed the situation like a small bump in the road, a temporary hurdle that he was getting ahead of with a smart plan. When I brought up the missed payments and the total debt, he waved it off like I was being uptight. He said something like, "It's not real debt if you're handling it." That line hit me in a way I didn't expect. Because that's how he's always seen things. If someone else is holding the bag, the weight doesn't count. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him. I asked him what his monthly payment would be post-consolidation. He guessed. I asked about the buy now pay later charges for the living room set and bedroom furniture. He blinked. I told him I'd already seen the amounts, the dates, and the payment statuses. I told him the only reason he qualified for any of those purchases was because his credit hadn't yet caught up to his choices. He got defensive. He said, "You would do this if you loved me." That was his closing argument. Not a plan. Not a promise. Just an emotional squeeze. But I'd heard it too many times before. I took out a single sheet of paper I'd prepared that morning. It was a simple agreement I had drafted, nothing binding, just a plain English disclosure. If I agreed to co-sign, I would receive full access to the consolidated account, monthly statements would be emailed to me directly, I'd be granted autopay control, and if any payment was 30 days late, I'd have the right to remove myself through refinancing or a buyout. He didn't like it. Said it felt like a trap. I said, "It's just transparency. If you're planning to pay, you have nothing to hide." His lips tightened, but eventually, he signed it. That was the moment I knew he needed me more than he wanted to admit. I walked away that night with no intention of ever signing the actual loan documents. But I now had something on paper, with his name and my conditions, and that document wasn't for his benefit, it was for mine. Because once you put a boundary in writing and get them to sign it, even under the illusion that you're playing along, it changes the game. And sure enough, once I got home, I pulled up an old email I had almost forgotten existed. It was a message I had sent my dad during my sophomore year of college when I was trying to apply for a housing grant. I had asked him to send a screenshot of the custodial account to verify that I wasn't receiving support. He had replied with a screenshot and a short message, "Closed last quarter, used for family needs." The date matched exactly with the transfer memo I saw in Evan's file. I sat there staring at the two pieces of evidence, the old email and the memo. The timeline wasn't vague anymore. It was exact. My money, the one fund that was supposed to support my education, had been liquidated right when Evan needed help getting into a house. They hadn't just helped him. They'd helped him with resources that were legally and ethically meant for me. And now they wanted me to co-sign a loan to clean up the consequences of that decision. I didn't confront anyone that night. I didn't send angry texts or call to demand an explanation. Instead, I created a folder on my desktop and labeled it plainly, Equalization. Because the way I saw it, I wasn't just going to say no. I was going to prepare a response that would make sure I never had to answer this kind of question again. When I tell you that I didn't grow up thinking I'd one day need a lawyer just to have a fair conversation with my own father, I mean it in the most literal sense. I was the kid who followed every rule, who sent thank you notes after Christmas even when I didn't feel like it, who turned in every scholarship form on time, and who never once assumed anything was owed to me. But sitting on my couch with a folder full of financial lies and quiet betrayals, I realized that playing by the rules hadn't protected me. It had just made me easy to reroute, easy to overlook, easy to drain, easy to frame as the strong one who could handle disappointment without making a scene. I wasn't interested in revenge. I wasn't angry in the shouting, explosive way people expect. I was just done pretending not to see it. And when you reach that point, the quiet clarity after the emotional storm, you start thinking in straight lines. I needed to understand exactly what my options were, not in some messy emotional sense, but in practical, legal terms. So I made an appointment with a consumer attorney. It wasn't a big thing, just a 1-hour consult, and I came prepared with notes, dates, emails, and the screenshot of the account closure from sophomore year. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't ask the attorney to fix my family. I just asked what happens when a custodial account, legally meant for a minor, is used for someone else's benefit without permission or compensation. The attorney wasn't dramatic. He explained things carefully and simply. If the account had been under a UTMA or UGMA designation, which mine had, and the funds were removed after I turned 18, then they should have been handed over directly to me. If they were used for someone else, that's a breach of fiduciary responsibility by the custodian, in this case, my dad. It didn't matter if it was done with good intentions or under family pressure. Legally, the money was mine, and unless I had signed off or benefited from its use, I had the right to request reimbursement or compensation. That one conversation changed the tone of everything. I no longer felt like someone trying to be understood. I felt like someone with a valid, documentable claim. But more than that, I realized I didn't have to shout or beg or argue. I just had to write clearly, ask for what was fair, and stand still while they scrambled to justify what they couldn't explain. I met my dad alone at a neutral spot, a coffee place near his office that didn't have too many people, but enough of a crowd to keep things civil. I didn't open with accusations. I didn't even mention the loan. I asked him about the custodial account, when it was closed, and where the money went. He hesitated, then defaulted to the old family language. We had to help Evan at the time. It was urgent. You were already working. We figured you'd understand. He said they meant to pay me back when things settled, but life got in the way. He said it with that practiced tone, part apology, part defense, part avoidance. I told him I didn't want to fight. I told him I wasn't looking to make a scene or take anything away from Evan. But I also said, calmly and directly, that I would not be tying my name to any loan until this issue was addressed, not emotionally, not verbally, but financially and legally. I said the word that made him pause: equalization. I explained it like this: the money used from my account helped secure Evan's house, whether they acknowledged it openly or not. And unless they intended to restore that value to me, I would be forced to protect my interests formally. I slid a sealed envelope across the table. Inside was a letter, polite, factual, and clear. It laid out the timeline of the account closure, the usage of funds, the link to the house down payment, and a proposed solution, a private promissory note in my favor for the same amount, secured by a lien on the property, payable upon sale or refinance, with a modest interest to adjust for time lost. Nothing aggressive. Nothing public. Just protection. He didn't open the envelope immediately. He stared at it like it might bite. Then he looked at me, and for a long moment, I saw something flicker across his face that wasn't anger or guilt, it was calculation. He realized I wasn't asking for justice. I was demanding balance. And I wasn't bluffing. He said, "You'd really go that far?" I answered without hesitation. I already did. And I meant it. Because the letter wasn't just in his hands. It had already been emailed to the title company, to Renee's inbox, and saved in a legal record folder on my cloud storage. It wasn't about threats. It was about establishing the fact that I was no longer the daughter who could be manipulated with sentiment and shame. That night, I received a short email from Renee, no greeting, no emotion, just a line saying they'd received the letter and would review the proposal. No denial. No outrage. Just silence that spoke louder than any argument could. I didn't respond. I didn't chase them for an answer. I had done what they never expected me to do. I stepped out of the emotional fog and walked directly into the light of clarity. They asked me to co-sign for my brother's debts. I asked them to acknowledge that they already took from me. And now the question wasn't whether I'd help, the question was whether they'd pay back what they owed, in the quiet, legal way that leaves no room for manipulation. There's a moment in every family where someone finally says something that changes how everyone else has to behave, and after that, the rules don't just shift, they crack, silently, right under the surface. That moment had already happened between me and my father, sitting across a small coffee table with an envelope full of facts and terms that nobody in our family had ever dared to write down before. But it wasn't until the following Sunday, when the entire family gathered for what Renee called a casual dinner, that I realized just how far that shift had traveled and how much harder they were now working to pretend that nothing had changed. Dinner was exactly what you'd expect, perfectly arranged place settings, overly bright smiles, and small talk so forced it could have passed as scripted. Renee was chirpy in that clipped, brittle way she always used when she was trying to control a situation through politeness. My dad barely looked up from his plate unless directly addressed, and Evan acted like nothing was happening at all. He made jokes, clinked his glass too loud, and kept talking about how this year was all about forward motion, like he hadn't just tried to drag me backward into his wreckage with a pen and a signature line. But then the tone shifted subtly at first, when Renee brought up the topic of family responsibility. She didn't mention the loan outright, but she didn't need to. She launched into this vague speech about how real families stick together, how sometimes people fall behind, and how stronger members of the family have a duty to create space for others to recover. The entire table knew what she meant. My dad didn't stop her. Evan didn't interrupt. Everyone just let the implication hang there like steam from a dish that had long gone cold. I waited until she paused, probably expecting me to nod or say something generically agreeable, and then, without raising my voice or shifting in my seat, I said, "I won't be co-signing the loan, and I've already asked to be made whole." There was a silence that dropped harder than any plate could have. Evan tried to recover with a weak laugh, like I was making a joke. Renee stared like I'd committed some kind of etiquette crime. My dad didn't even look surprised. He just looked tired. What I didn't do, and what I think surprised them most, was explain myself. I didn't launch into a justification or walk them through the math again or try to soften the blow with emotional language. I had already done the emotional labor. What was left now were facts and consequences. I didn't stay much longer after that. I finished my water, cleared my plate without being asked, and said goodnight. As I walked to my car, I didn't feel powerful or victorious. I felt like someone who had finally stopped bleeding in the dark. The next morning, I sent a formal email. Not to argue. Not to provoke. Just to document. I included a PDF packet with all relevant documentation, the custodial account screenshot, the timeline, the loan file with the memo that tied the funds to the down payment, the disclosure Evan had signed about account visibility, and a copy of the equalization letter. I added a 2-sentence message that stated, clearly and without sentiment, that I would no longer discuss financial matters verbally and that any further proposals or decisions should be made in writing. I copied both my dad and Renee. I did not copy Evan. That part was intentional. At the same time, I submitted a voluntary notice of interest to the county recorder's office, not a lien yet, just a public record that an unresolved financial interest existed on the property. It was the softest legal footprint I could make, but it made it visible. It wouldn't prevent Evan from living in the house, but it would appear during any refinancing, title transfer, or future sale. In short, it reminded everyone that this wasn't going away quietly. I wasn't shouting in the street. I was simply stepping into the system they'd used to their advantage, only now I was using it too. 2 days later, I got a call from Evan's potential lender. They wanted to verify my participation in the Cosign loan, and thanks to the disclosure agreement he had signed, the one giving me administrative access, I had the legal grounds to speak. I calmly informed them that I was withdrawing myself from the application, that I did not authorize the use of my credit, and that I would not be joining any current or future agreements related to his debts. The woman on the other end didn't even sound surprised. She just thanked me, noted my statement, and closed the file. And just like that, the loan evaporated. That night, Renee called me. Her voice was sharp, not loud, but clipped and cold, like every word was being pushed through a filter of anger she wasn't used to being denied. She said, "If you don't take this back, we will cut you off." I waited a beat and then asked, "From what exactly?" She didn't respond right away. I didn't fill the silence. I let it hang. Eventually, she ended the call with a clipped goodbye. There was a time when that kind of threat might have worked on me, when the idea of being shut out of family gatherings, group chats, and holiday plans would have felt like exile. But now I saw it for what it was, leverage that only worked when I still believed the connection was unconditional. If staying included meant accepting silence, debt, and unequal treatment, then it wasn't a connection worth preserving. And so, without any grand confrontation, I changed the balance of power. Not by screaming or slamming doors, but by documenting, filing, declining, and responding only in writing. Every move I made was quiet, deliberate, and final. They had relied for years on the fact that I wouldn't fight back. But they hadn't planned for what would happen if I simply refused to participate. Not emotionally. Not financially. Not anymore. There's something strange about the moment when you realize you don't need anything from the people who once held your life in their hands, not their approval, not their apologies, and certainly not their explanations. That moment came for me a week after the silence began, after the cold calls stopped, and after the family group chat turned eerily quiet except for a string of birthday emojis for someone else. I didn't chase them. I didn't check in. I let it sit. And when my dad finally called, I knew the conversation wasn't going to be about guilt or justification. It was going to be about logistics, the kind of talk people have when emotion has run out and only facts remain. He didn't ask to meet at home, and I didn't offer. Instead, we sat in his car in a parking lot behind his office building, like two coworkers settling a contract dispute in neutral territory. He had a yellow envelope in his lap and a coffee in his hand that he barely touched. He looked thinner than I remembered, not in a dramatic way, but like someone who had stopped sleeping through the night. And when he finally spoke, his voice had none of the paternal weight it used to carry. It was low, tired, and almost formal. He said the money from my custodial account had been used to stabilize the offer on Evan's house because the initial financing fell through 2 days before closing. He said they didn't have time to ask and that they figured it was a family decision, not a theft. He used the word bridge, as if draining my legal college funds to gift my brother a foundation was some kind of temporary measure, like a folding chair you borrow and promise to return later, only to forget for years. He didn't say sorry. He said, "We didn't know what else to do." I didn't react. I had rehearsed that moment too many times in my head to allow for anything spontaneous. I handed him a small binder, nothing dramatic, nothing aggressive, just a plain folder with a final draft of the private promissory note. It included the full amount used, the interest adjusted for time, and a lien clause that protected me without touching the property's current value or use. I wasn't taking the house. I wasn't forcing a sale. I was simply securing what was already mine and documenting a path to recovery that couldn't be forgotten, excused, or erased later. He didn't argue. He signed. When it was over, We sat there in silence for another minute, and for the first time, I felt something I hadn't expected, not satisfaction or triumph, but something closer to grief. Not for the money or the house or even the relationship, but for the version of myself that used to believe I owed my silence to keep the peace. That version had sat through years of lopsided support, one-sided expectations, and carefully worded advice like, pick your battles and be the bigger person. But that version of me had never been in the room when my money was moved, my voice was dismissed, and my role in the family was silently reduced to a backup plan. I didn't tell Evan about the agreement. I didn't need to. The lien would sit quietly on the title, visible to anyone who ever touched the paperwork again. If he refinanced, I'd be notified. If he tried to sell, I'd be paid. If they ignored it, it would continue to accumulate the modest interest I had set not to punish, but to remind. There would be no need for future arguments, no family interventions, no long-winded explanations at holidays. I had removed myself from the emotional battlefield entirely and placed the outcome in a document that didn't care who was louder or more charming or more in need of a second chance. Later that week, I sent a short text to Evan. No threats. No speeches. Just one sentence. I won't be your backup plan. Then I blocked the conversation thread and moved the file folder into my long-term archives. It was over, not because anyone had apologized, and not because I had forgiven anyone, but because I had reclaimed something more important than fairness. I had reclaimed finality. Over coffee that weekend, Maya asked me how it felt, not just the win, but the process. I told her the truth. I always thought the strongest move was a speech, I said, stirring my cup without looking up. Turns out it's a document. She laughed, but she understood. Because the real power wasn't in getting even. It was in stepping out of the narrative they'd written for me and writing something quieter, firmer, and entirely mine. They can rewrite the story at family gatherings all they want. They can say I was dramatic, or cold, or ungrateful. But the county recorder's office doesn't care about tone. And neither does the future. The truth is sitting there, in a single recorded entry, my name, my claim, my quiet no. And that, in the end, was all I needed. I didn't win by shouting. I didn't win by arguing. I won because I stopped asking for permission to be treated fairly and started enforcing it with actions no one could erase. And maybe the saddest part is that it took losing something to learn that. But the most satisfying part? I didn't lose myself in the process. I found the version of me that doesn't flinch, doesn't fold, and doesn't cosign away her own future. Not for love, not for family, and definitely not for a man who was handed a house and still thought someone else should carry his debt.